Chapter 1. The Realization. Susan sat at her desk, the cold morning light seeping through the blinds, casting geometric shadows on the papers sprawled before her. It was a typical Monday, or so it felt. But in this moment, as she stared blankly at an unfinished article about rising stock prices, something shifted inside her, a silent, creeping recognition that the life she once knew was crumbling away. She didn't need the text message from unknown to confirm it, but there it was. "I'm sorry, I had to work late again." The familiar sting of betrayal laced with guilt bubbled within her. She should have known better than to believe in fairy tales. After all, she'd been writing about the harsh realities of corporate America for years. Her office, a sleek high-rise on the edge of the financial district, hummed with the predictable chaos of Monday morning, keyboards clacking, phones buzzing, and the occasional heated debate echoing through cubicles. But to Susan, it was just white noise, masking the turmoil within her marriage. She glanced around the room, the familiar sights now tainted by William's absence, his chair empty, his computer dark. The smell of burnt coffee from a nearby office served as a harsh reminder of their last argument. He had stormed out, leaving behind the scorched pot and an angry, unspoken truth. He was always working. Their schedules clashed like rival stocks on a downswing. William's job demanded late nights and endless calls, while Susan's role at the financial paper required her to be where the news was, at meetings, in courts, or huddled in dark alleys with sources. She remembered how they once laughed about being each other's constants. Now, it seemed like a cruel joke. Her mind wandered back to their anniversary dinner just a week ago, how she'd made a point of it, hoping he'd realize the effort and reciprocate with something more than a quick text before his meeting. The harsh ring of her phone shattered that memory. She hesitated before answering, knowing what was coming. Another late-night work call, another missed chance at intimacy. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the silence in their apartment, the emptiness echoing like her unanswered questions. Or perhaps it was that text from unknown, a silent accusation of his infidelity. Susan took a deep breath and answered, steeling herself for what she might face on the other end. Not just another fight, but the realization that their marriage had become nothing more than a statistic in the cold, unforgiving column of divorce numbers. Chapter 2. The Turning Point. Susan picked up the phone, her hand trembling slightly. She knew from experience that once she began this conversation, there would be no going back to how things were before. And yet, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment everything changed. "Hello," her voice faltered as she spoke into the receiver, a stark contrast to her usual confident tone in both her professional and personal life. The voice on the other end was muffled, distorted by poor connection or perhaps intentional evasion. "Susan." She clenched her jaw, trying to hold on to her resolve. "Yes, who is this?" A pause heavy with unspoken words. Then I need to see you, it's important." The line buzzed with static as she processed the request, a cold dread creeping up her spine. She glanced around the office. Colleagues were too engrossed in their work to notice her distress. "Why?" The word felt like a challenge, a defiant demand for answers amidst the chaos of her thoughts. I can't explain over the phone. Can we meet somewhere neutral?" Susan hesitated. Neutral was just another term she'd written about in her job, an office meeting room, a coffee shop down the street. But here it felt different, ominous. "Where?" She tried to keep her tone even but couldn't shake off the growing unease. "A park bench on 5th and Main. 1 o'clock, please." The call ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Susan staring at the receiver in shock. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. She spent the remainder of her day in a blur, barely registering the emails she replied to or the meetings she attended. When her alarm signaled 12:45 p.m., she felt like she was moving through quicksand, each second dragging out into an eternity. As she packed up her things and headed toward the elevator, she caught glimpses of her colleagues, some typing away at their desks with determination, others stealing furtive glances at clocks. None seemed to notice her turmoil. She made it outside just as the clock struck 1. Fifth and Main was bustling with life, people hurrying about on their lunch breaks, children laughing in strollers, cars honking impatiently at the lights. Her eyes searched for a park bench amidst the chaos until they landed on a solitary figure sitting under a worn-out oak tree. A familiar figure, or what was left of him. William looked up as she approached, his face etched with lines that hadn't been there before. His eyes met hers and something shifted within her. It was an acknowledgement, a silent apology, and a plea all wrapped into one glance. Susan took a deep breath and sat down beside him on the bench. The smells of freshly cut grass and city pollution mingled in the air, grounding her in reality. This wasn't a dream. This was happening. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice shaking as much as hers had during that phone call. She turned to him, her heart pounding against her. "For what?" The words spilled out of him like confessions: late nights at the office, secret meetings with colleagues, a borrowed apartment downtown when he couldn't find one in time for the weekend getaway they'd planned. His voice broke as he recounted his mistakes, and Susan felt something inside her break too. She remembered all those mornings she waited up for him, all those nights she fell asleep reading or watching TV alone. The betrayal wasn't just about the infidelity, but about how it unraveled their entire life together. As William spoke, tears welled in his eyes, and he reached out to take her hand, a desperate attempt at connection. Susan's mind raced. This was the turning point she had sensed coming since that text message from unknown. Yet in that moment of raw emotion shared on a park bench in broad daylight, Susan realized something profound. Divorce wasn't just about them. It was about the life they'd built together, its flaws and fissures slowly revealing themselves. She couldn't help but wonder if this would be the first step toward healing or further heartache. Either way, their marriage had officially entered uncharted territory, much like the financial markets she analyzed daily. And Susan knew she had to prepare for the unpredictable downturns that were sure to come. They sat there, two figures against a backdrop of urban life and nature's resilient growth, caught in the middle of a story neither could predict or rewrite. Chapter 3: The Fallout. Susan couldn't shake off the feeling that her world had tilted on its axis as she sat beside William on that worn-out park bench. The truths he shared, his voice cracking under the weight of regret, painted a picture she hadn't seen before, a tapestry woven with threads of betrayal, neglect, and unmet expectations. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the couple as they grappled with their reality. Susan's mind was a whirlwind of questions and untold stories from William's late nights and secret meetings. But amidst her anger and hurt, there lay an undercurrent of sadness, a shared despair that seemed to whisper, "We've both been living lies." Their hands remained clasped together. His grip was a plea for forgiveness, while hers felt like the tentative grasp of someone clinging to hope. The city around them continued its frenetic pace, seemingly unfazed by their personal crisis. "I don't know how we go back from this," Susan finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I thought we were, it's all been based on lies." William closed his eyes momentarily as if trying to gather the strength needed for what he was about to say next. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I love you, Susan. I love us. But sometimes I felt like I was drowning in this job, and I didn't know how to keep my head above water." Susan turned her gaze away from him, letting the city's chaos fill the void. It wasn't just William who had been struggling. Their lives together were a series of unspoken tensions and unresolved conflicts. "We've both been drowning," she admitted quietly. As they sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, Susan realized that this was just the beginning of their fall from grace. A divorce, not just between them but within themselves as individuals. It wasn't going to be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be clean. Their story would become yet another statistic, but one that she intended to tell with all its raw, messy details, because that's where truth lay, in the imperfect, unvarnished reality of their lives. Susan knew she needed to prepare herself for what was next, not just financially or legally, but emotionally. She thought about her column, her articles on the stock market, where numbers dictated trends and futures. Her marriage, it seemed, had been following a similar trajectory: unseen fissures, ignored warnings, inevitable decline. Standing up from the bench, Susan felt a sense of resolve wash over her. She took one last look at William before turning away. "I need time to think," she said, and with that, she began walking back toward the office building. Behind her, William sat alone on the bench, his hand still clutching the space where hers had been moments ago. He watched as Susan disappeared into the crowd, a new reality settling over him. His marriage was crumbling like the worn-out oak tree they'd once sought comfort under. Susan didn't make it back to the office that day. Instead, she found herself at the local library, researching divorce law and searching for strength in the stories of others who had faced similar battles. She knew this wasn't just about dissolving a marriage but rewriting her life's narrative, a tale of loss perhaps, but also of potential rebirth. And as she sat amidst the musty silence of the library's archives, Susan made herself a promise: to face this chapter of her story head-on, with all its raw, brutal honesty. The days ahead would be fraught with uncertainty and pain, but with each step forward, she'd rewrite her future, one informed by the truths she'd uncovered in those pages. Because just like the market trends she'd spent years analyzing, life's unpredictability could either devastate or inspire growth. And Susan was determined to find the latter hidden within the former, a phoenix rising from the ashes of what once was, ready to redefine herself and her place in the world outside of her marriage. Chapter 4: The Rebirth. Susan spent countless hours at the library that week, immersing herself in the annals of divorce. She scoured through legal documents and memoirs, each page offering both solace and trepidation. The stories she read were hers to write, not just the bitter end, but the messy middle ground where her story was currently teetering. The silence of the library became a refuge for Susan, a place where the outside world's chaos couldn't reach her as she contemplated her future. It wasn't long before the musty smell of old books and the soft hum of fluorescent lights became comforting. She discovered that divorce, like the market trends she covered in her articles, was unpredictable and complex, influenced by unforeseen events, miscalculations, and human emotions. Yet amidst the legal jargon and sorrowful confessions, Susan found fragments of hope, stories where people had emerged stronger, wiser, from the ashes of their marriages. Susan's thoughts were interrupted by a gentle tap on her shoulder. She turned to find an elderly librarian, her face etched with kindness, holding out a thick file. "I couldn't help overhearing," the librarian said softly. "You're going through quite a bit right now." Susan was taken aback but welcomed the unexpected support. The woman handed her a compilation of divorce stories, each chapter more inspiring than the last. As she began reading, Susan found herself swept up in tales of resilience and new beginnings. It struck a chord within her: here were real people who'd faced the same fears and uncertainties she was feeling now. That evening, back at their empty apartment, Susan sat across from William with the file open on her lap. She had decided that honesty was the only way forward. It was time they confronted the reality of their situation together. "William," she began, her voice steady despite the anxiety churning inside her, "I've been reading about divorce, about people who went through what we're going through." She watched as he leaned in, a mix of apprehension and curiosity on his face. "I realized that our story, it's not just ours anymore. It's part of something bigger," she continued, gesturing to the file. stories of people starting anew, finding happiness even after heartache. William's eyes flickered with understanding and something akin to hope. They spent hours into the night discussing their future, their fears, and most importantly, their dreams. It wasn't a reconciliation in the traditional sense. Rather, it was an acknowledgement that their relationship had transformed. They were no longer the same two people who had sat on that park bench months ago. Their bond had been tested by betrayal, but also tempered into something stronger, more real. Over the coming weeks and months, they embarked on a journey of rediscovery, not as a couple but as individuals forging new paths in life. Susan threw herself back into her work with renewed vigor, delving deep into the complexities of human relationships for her articles. She saw parallels between the market's unpredictability and their lives, a constant flux between stability and chaos. William started therapy, grappling with his feelings of guilt and the underlying reasons behind his infidelity. He sought to be a better person, a better partner, even if that meant within the confines of separate homes. Their divorce was amicable. They both understood it was necessary for their personal growth. The paperwork was drawn up, the legalities settled in a series of meetings where emotions were kept in check, a stark contrast to how things used to be. The day they signed the final papers felt anticlimactic. It wasn't the end of a fairy tale, but a new chapter in their lives. They exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Beneath the surface of acceptance and sorrow lay the promise of a rebirth. As Susan stepped out of the courthouse, she was met with the bright sunlight of a new beginning. She took a deep breath and let the air fill her lungs, carrying with it the scent of possibility. William stood beside her, his hand finding hers in an unspoken agreement that this wasn't the end, but rather the start of something new, for both of them. Together, they walked away from the courthouse not as husband and wife, but as two individuals stepping towards the future. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential setbacks, but also filled with the promise of personal growth and unforeseen opportunities. And in that moment, amidst the concrete jungle and beneath the ever-changing sky, Susan knew she had found a strength within herself she never knew existed. A strength forged by the trials of marriage, divorce, and the raw honesty of their story, her story. She was no longer just a wife going through a divorce. She was Susan, standing on the brink of an undefined tomorrow, ready to redefine herself in the market of life. And so they walked forward, side by side yet separate, into the chapters of their lives that lay unwritten and full of promise.